I could use it. It's kind of shiny up here.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to bring this June 2022 CVTA Finance Committee meeting to order. I want to thank everyone for joining us today here in person, those who are viewing us virtually. I'm trusting that everyone is doing well as the summer begins to heat up. And with that, I'm going to ask Ms. Firestone to certify whether or not we have a quorum today.
Chesterfield County, Mr. Carroll.
I am here.
Hanover County, Vice Chair Peterson.
I'm here.
Henrico County, Mr. Thornton. City of Richmond, Chair Stoney.
I'm here.
Commonwealth Transportation Board, Mr. Brown. That concludes roll call, and we do have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Ms. Firestone. We will now move on to item 1.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Patricia Page is with us today. It might be nice to recognize her, or actually even have her join us at the table if she'd like.
Those in attendance, Ms. Page is here with us from New Kent County. Ms. Page, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for being with us. Obviously, we will invite you to the table. Members of the Finance Committee are the only ones to participate in a Finance Committee meeting, so you are welcome to come to the table or have your seat here in the audience.
Thank you, sir. I humbly appreciate the opportunity, and I will sit here as an observer today.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Page. All right, we'll move to item 1 of the agenda, consideration of amendments to the action meeting agenda. I have no changes. Do we have any suggested changes?
No, sir.
If okay, there's no changes, we'll move on to item 2, the approval of the May 23rd, 2022 meeting minutes.
Move for approval.
There's a motion to approve those minutes. It's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. The meeting minutes were approved. On to item 3, the open public comment period. Mr. Parsons, are there any individuals who've signed up for virtual comment or in-person comment?
We do not have any requests ahead of time, and there's only staff on the Zoom, so no requests.
No requests in person or virtually?
That's correct.
Seeing none, we'll move on to item 4, the CVTA Finance Committee Chairman's Report. I do not have a formal Chairman's Report today, but I do want to thank each of you first for the attendance at the meeting at the Plan RVA and all of our other partners, Plan RVA, CVTA, all coming together last week at VDOT. And also I want to thank each of you in advance for the work together we've been doing to seek a resolution to I-64 and regional funding. You know, as members of the Finance Committee, we have over the past several weeks had meetings with legislators from the region, and they've been able to tell us how much money is needed for the I-64 project to work. I want to thank our friends in the General Assembly who have made some investments as well, those in the House and the Senate. I always like to see when elected officials, those who are considered politicians, put their money where their mouths are. And while the FLT was not finalized, a complete report and funding of the segments were available for the committee to make our funding decisions. Today's meeting is important because we have the responsibility to stand in solidarity and support our regional partner, our friends in New Kent County. But we must also consider if our recommendation to the full authority is sound and can guide us on supplementing such an important and significant project for the Commonwealth, but also for the greater Richmond region as well. Lastly, we also have to decide if and how we go about working with our partners to the southeast and HRTAC as well to bring this project to fruition too, alongside our friends at the Commonwealth and also at the federal level too. And so with that slight introduction, I'll now ask that Mr. Parsons and Ms. Moore-Clark, if you have item 5 in the CBT activities report.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I will start briefly. Secretary Miller kind of gave an overview of this at the joint meeting last week, but the conference reports from the state budget do have significant investments in transportation. A summary of To start with trails, there is two different allocations of 41.5 million and 37.5 million in FY22 for establishment of the State Trails Office, plus an additional, I believe, 14 million split evenly over 2 years to establish that office and get it moving in terms of being able to offer competitive grant opportunities for regional trails. So that's great news for the Fall Line and others in our region. We're looking forward to working with member governments to compete for those funds and hopefully use some of the power of the CVTA to leverage those applications so that they're successful. I-64 has received commitments of 110 million and 210 million for a total of 320 million over 2 years, and then an additional 150 million contingent on revenues meeting targets, which would come at a later date. So for a total of 470 million possible through the state budget. So that's great news, and I think is a foundation for the discussions that this committee and the full authority may have. There are other urban-suburban development type of commitments through the budget, including housing funding, major water projects and wastewater projects, CSOs, and I'm sure that member government staff have got a good handle on those types of things. But I wanted to highlight the transportation commitments so that we have a basis of understanding moving forward. The financial activities and investment reports.
Mr. Peterson.
Could I ask a question on it?
Sure.
Yes, sir.
You said that the budget sets up the Trails Office, but you had $78 million. Is that just for operation, or is that for funds to be used?
That's including funds to be distributed. Most of that is funds to be distributed. Okay. I'm not sure there's clarity on how much is actually set aside. I believe there's 800,000 I saw to set up the office and put everything in place so that it's operating and able to distribute funds. And I think everything else, my understanding, is to be used for grants.
I was afraid they were growing it real quick.
Right. And our staff is tracking that, and as well as many of the localities. So we'll be sure to pass along more information as possible. I don't think there is anything actually committed directly to the Fall Line at this point, but we could provide other information when we know it.
Well, I guess we'll have to keep an eye, Mr. Chair, on the application process to make sure that if there's anything we need to do as an organization to help facilitate that we do it.
Concur. Any more questions for Mr. Parsons? On the financial activities?
Yes, sir. Just for your information, on page 6.
Oh, there was a question.
Mr. Brown, let the record show that Mr. Brown is in attendance.
I'm always here, even if you don't see me. You know that, right? Don't sleep. Right. There is a provision in the budget that also makes some of the funding contingent upon the CBTA and HR TAC contributing, right? I mean, there is a provision, and maybe it's for the second the leveraging of the latter amount, but it's contingent upon the CBTA and HR TAC making contribution.
I think, yes, I believe you're correct. I don't have the exact language in front of me, but
I think it's important that this body understand that was placed in the budget very deliberately and intentionally, just to be clear. So
Is that the second part of the funding? The 320 is free and clear, right?
That would be the 150 million.
that's what I think.
150,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that point because, yeah.
Mr. Parsons?
thank you. Page 6 is the financial activities investment report showing activity to date as of May 31st. And the investment report follows as of April of 2022. Happy to take any questions, but looks like trends are continuing as they were.
Any question on the reports and the activities?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm still very concerned that we're losing money on all our investments at this point. We're still, I mean, when I look at the benchmarking, we're lower than any of the benchmarks around. And with today's inflation, we're actually going backwards on our investments. So I think we need to do something to get ourselves straight on this.
Mr. Chair, if I can speak to that.
Mr. Carroll?
I think the direction that our treasurer needs is a timeline on when the funds are gonna be needed that we've committed to the fall line. As soon as we can get a timeline from VDOT or whoever as to when those funds will need to be dispersed, we can start doing investments on a monthly basis with those funds. And that's really the holdup. And until someone can tell us, it makes no sense to put the money in and then all of a sudden have to yank it back out because we now have to allocate it. So she's ready to go. I don't know where we need to get that, if that's from Mr. Mann or somebody else, but as soon as we get that, we can do it.
Mr. Chair, that's absolutely correct. We're working with Ms. Longnecker and Mr. Ure and Ms. Moore-Clark at the TAC to understand when those funds are going to be necessary. I mean, Mr. Carroll said it exactly the right way. I think the Chesterfield County is ready to go once we know how long the funds are available before they need to be spent.
I don't think there's any question there, but I think there is an urgency that we have to consider, that we need to get to this point so that we are not keep going backwards with the funds we've collected.
Don't disagree. Just need the timeline.
Well, it's my hope that whoever is responsible for the timeline, we get it as soon as possible. All right. Are we going to Ms. Moore-Clark now?
Good morning, Mr. Chair.
Good morning.
Members of the Finance Committee, today I have a brief report. It is on the Fall Line Trail. Right now, we're currently about to distribute the draft design guidelines, expected to go to the localities this week. So this is what and how we expect the trail to look. It's also comes with an agreement to develop a phased furnish and install contract for the trail signage, such as wayfinding and amenities. And currently we're still waiting, and I'll defer to Mr. Gregory on the SPAs, the spas for the design build, and then the locality spa updates. And those are actually the agreements that will allow the timeline to be created based on localities then being able to spend the money. So right now, VDOT nor the localities can actually spend the fall line money or develop a timeline based on just, the procedural thing of getting the agreements in place.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Ms. Moore-Clark. We have exchanged drafts of the SPA, the project agreement with VDOT. It is in their hands now to respond to our input. Once we get their input back, which I'm hoping will be very, very soon, we discussed it just within the past few days, we'll be in a place to bring something forward. So we'll keep you posted on that. That's in process. Once we have that agreement will serve as a template for the SPAs, which we will have with Henrico and the city of Richmond. I'm not so sure at this point that whether SPAs are necessary with the other jurisdictions through which the Fall Line Trail will flow, because VDOT will be administering those projects through the SPA they have with the CVTA, and that will provide the funding. So the localities, VDOT will facilitate the work with the localities, but the localities themselves will not need to have an SPA themselves. But because Henrico and City of Richmond are administering those projects themselves within their jurisdictions, an SPA with the CVTA would be necessary.
Mr. Peterson.
Do we have dates? We keep saying until this comes or this happens and this happens. Are we looking at estimated dates when these things are gonna happen?
Those timelines are in the SPA, are in the agreement itself, and they provide for the allocation of funding and distribution of funds and that timeline.
When has VDOT said they're gonna get this information back to us? These are the kind of, I mean, if we just keep saying when we get it, we're not getting anywhere until we start putting some pressure that we need to get this information.
We believe it's
Do we have
in the
any
near term.
information? Just near term. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's all.
I mean,
can
I didn't
share
know whether
right now.
VDOT has told us, we're planning to get this back to you by the end of June or 1st of July.
I think it's any day now, we'll get their response back.
Okay.
So could be by
Thank
the
you.
end of this week or the end of next week, but very, very soon.
As soon as we get it,
Yeah, that's a very vague term.
she'll get the green light.
And I think from the CVTA tax standpoint, I think we can work over July and maybe the early August to have a more detailed spending plan of all the segments of the money as well. So I think, and if we need to make that sooner than the 1st of August for your August meeting, then we'll try to potentially have additional meetings.
That'd be great, but I realize you need the information to be able to do that, so. I guess that's why I'm sort of saying we need to stay on top of the information sources to get this information as quickly as possible.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Price.
One additional comment on that, I think that I don't feel like we're up against the wall yet. The design build for the north section on the VDOT side is still in development, so I don't think we're quite ready to kick things off yet on that. And I know on the locality side, everybody's gearing up, but I don't think we're at the point where anything's ready to be put out to bid yet. So we're
We're
obviously
using our own
working.
call, so we're ready to go, Richmond.
Yep. Oh, okay. Well, there we go.
Thank you for that clarification.
Good.
Locked and loaded.
Any other questions, comments? Ms. Moore Clark, got anything else?
No, sir. Thank you.
All right, that's the conclusion of the CVTA activities report on item 5. We'll now move on to old business. Item 6 is the support services MOU and with Plan RVA. That's Ms. Heater and Mr. Gregory.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gregory and I have been working to put together a new memorandum of understanding between Plan RVA and the CBTA. Our hope is that we'll be able to route this back through the Finance Committee for first look in July, and then be able to have it be on the agenda for the full authority meeting at the July 15th regular meeting. Really, I think what we're waiting for is the update on the status of the search process for the executive director, just so that we have some of the finer points around the conclusion of that onboarding and timeline for that. But we're operating under the assumption that that process is moving forward and that decisions will be made, and we'll be pretty much ready to go with the position seated here at Plan RVA sometime this summer, depending on what the selection process yields. I just wanted to go through a couple of points, and Mr. Gregory, feel free to chime in, but wanted to talk through a little bit of the construction of the agreement, just so that that's on the Finance Committee members' minds. We are proposing a support services agreement term of 5 years, so that we can have a little bit of more continuity in our planning and staff preparation to be able to think a little bit longer term. But it does include a provision where either party would be able to terminate with notice. So I think that there's still that opportunity for there to be an annual review of the work plan and the work to be provided in above and beyond the provision of the executive director position to the authority. We've had a lot of discussion at both the CVTA and the Plan RVA bodies about the provisions that are necessary with regard to the authority's authority over the position, the executive director. And so Mr. Gregory, I think, has crafted some good language that specifies in detail that Plan RVA holds responsibility for the administration of payroll and benefits, that the personnel policy of Plan RVA is the prevailing document for guidance to the employee, but the performance evaluation, the negotiation of salary, and the direction with regard to priorities and work plan are the responsibility of the CVTA. And so that relationship is a direct connection to the executive director position and not something that rolls through the administrative leadership or the board leadership of Plan RVA. We've also included provisions to be able to provide for additional staff support. So as you all are aware, Ms. Firestone, as an example, is an employee of Plan RVA. She holds responsibilities that are on the Plan RVA side of things, if you will, as well as on the CVTA side of things. And so we'll essentially be selling her time to the CVTA in support of that. And so obviously we'll have opportunity to be able to provide additional staff support services as have been provided over the last 2 years through that additional staffing support to be able to keep planning support. I know Mr. Bushing and Mr. Ariel and Ms. Ryan have been all, probably among others, have been supports to Mr. Parsons over the last 2 years. So that team will continue to have time available to the CBTA. We also have our administrative systems in place to be able to continue to help, and we've incorporated some language into the MOU that provides for all of those administrative systems, if you will, to extend to the CBTA. So access to our IT, procurement services, financial administration, extension of cash flow for operating, all of those provisions have been in here. And I'll just note, thanks to Matt Harris also for helping me kind of think through how to deal with the minutia of this arrangement, like credit card use policy and equipment allocation and that kind of thing. So those things are all outlined in the draft MOU. So it is meatier than what you've seen in the previous cycles, but hopefully to be able to address all of the different dimensions of this new relationship. And you've already established a budget, so we're operating with the idea that this 5-year agreement would be detailed each year during your fiscal planning, so that the operating budget would determine the extent that the services that Plan RVA provides each calendar, or rather fiscal year. Mr. Gregory, do you have?
That about covers it. We're providing, as Ms. Heater mentioned, we understand that the priority is to have the executive director of the CVTA subject to the authority of the CVTA board, but that the administrative and back office services will be provided by Plan RVA. So in essence, this person will be a Plan RVA employee, so that Plan RVA can provide those payroll and benefits to that person and still comply with insurance requirements with its carriers. But that the person will be hired and fired, if you will, by the CVTA and subject to their direction on performance of duties and work plan and that kind of thing. So that's the direction we're going in, and that's the draft MOU that we have at present that we're working with provides for that. And so if there's any change or any desire to change that direction, or anything you want to ask us to think about more thoroughly, please let us know. But that's where we're going.
I'll just add that the executive committee and full commission did take action at their last regular meeting to amend the pay and compensation plan for Plan RVA, so that we have a rung in the ladder, if you will, that provides for the salary band that the CVTA has contemplated for the position. We've also continued to incorporate CVTA into the planning for our new office space. So as you all probably recall, we are scheduled to move out of this location October 31. So we do have plans for the CVTA executive director to be located with an office, a dedicated office in the new space on Hull Street. And obviously all of the meeting facilities will be available to the CVTA going forward as well. So during that transition, I will just alert everyone that we will be looking for potential alternative locations. I know Mr. Peterson will be an active member in that conversation, but we will be making sure that the needs of the CVTA and its meetings during the fall months and during our space relocation will be taken care of.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on that, just to provide some assurance, the existing MOU that the CVTA has with Plan RVA continues until terminated and automatically renews. So we're not up against a deadline like July 1. The existing MOU is gonna go out of existence. It continues, so you still have that to rely upon. It's just the new MOU will take its place and terminate the old one, but we're still in good stead with the existing MOU.
Any questions, any comments? Well, I want to say, I would be remiss if not thank our partners at Plan RVA for the support, from the inception of CVTA. We would not be here today if it wasn't for those who work on the staff, who spend a lot of time devoted to standing up this authority, not only this committee, but this entire authority that crosses numerous jurisdictions. So I want to appreciate the time and effort you all have put into ensuring that this authority is a success, and not just a success on paper, but a success that is seen by taxpayers and residents in multiple localities. So thank you. All right, we'll now move on to new business. New business is the item 7, CVTA Regional Funding Commitment Update, and I'm going to begin with Mr. Parsons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you note on the agenda, we have 3 items here that are listed, but I think this is going to be a fairly organic conversation about I-64 and all the moving parts that are happening. So I understand if we need to divert from how the agenda has things listed. I did want to note that the first item, 7A, is basically an overview of what happened at our April 29th meeting, and then possible direction that the authority may consider taking as we move forward. But I think the bulk of the conversation should be about what we're able to do as an authority in terms of supporting all of the important regional projects. Mr. Roddy from PFM is here with us, and we've been working on some content to share in terms of the authority's capacity and what the options are going to be. So I'll certainly defer to him at some point in this conversation, and we have some information to share on the screen as well for those who are following at home. I think just a quick review of what happened on the 29th. We had a scheduled public hearing with all of the public review that is necessary for a slate of 30 projects that were scored and ranked according to the state code. This committee recommended that slate for consideration by the full authority, and that's what was on the agenda at that meeting on the 29th. There was lively discussion and consideration of that slate of projects. And then there were multiple attempts at action on the slate, and at the meeting, according to what the best information we had, none of those actions carried through. So there was some uncertainty about the slate of 30 projects. We have since learned that the interpretation of the code, outlining the different criteria for how a vote occurs at the authority, was a little murky, and we have since learned that there's a strong likelihood, if not a definitive answer, that we were including an extra voting check that was not necessary according to the language in the code. So there's some discussion to be had in terms of what that vote actually ended up being and whether it was valid or not. So I think the first question is, if the Finance Authority, obviously discussion, but if there's any recommendation coming out of the Finance Authority regarding that vote or guidance that the committee wants to make for the meeting next Friday of the full authority, and then consideration of I-64, which was not in that list of 30 projects. Obviously, this discussion happened on the 29th as well, and it has carried through. So that's kind of setting the table for what the committee might want to consider today. As I said, Mr. Roddy's here to talk through options in addition to the slate of projects that were up for public review. We have some other ideas to share in terms of additional support for I-64 or other projects, if that's the direction that we need to go.
All right, we'll open it up for discussion.
I think I want to ask Mr. Gregory to touch, opine a little bit on the conclusion that he came to after the meeting, that's included in the proposed minutes for our next full CVTA meeting, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gregory.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Finance Committee. It's an interesting issue, one that challenges one's interpretation of the statute fundamentally. The sentence at issue in the statute is in section 33.2, 3705, decisions of the authority. And the sentence states, decisions of the authority shall require an affirmative vote of those present and voting whose votes represent at least 4/5 of the population embraced by the authority. And then it goes, and there's a semicolon and it goes on. But that's the pertinent part that we're dealing with. Now, from the beginning of the establishment of the authority, everybody, including myself and representatives of the local jurisdictions and the TAC, and even when we were developing the voting tool, we were under the understanding that affirmative vote is a majority vote, right? That's what Robert's Rules provides. An affirmative vote is a majority vote of the votes held by the body. But Robert's Rules also provides that it's an affirmative vote is a majority vote unless the laws or rules of the body provide otherwise. And so that exception seems to be at play here, or is at play here. When you look at affirmative vote, how you interpret that particular sentence, if you read it, it reads that an affirmative vote is those votes cast that represent 4/5 of the population embraced by the authority. So if those votes cast equal or represent 4/5 of the majority of the population of the region, then the vote carries. There is no requirement for a majority of votes to be cast to approve something. So in essence, practically speaking, a 12 votes cast by, for instance, the city of Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield can overrule a 14 votes of the remaining members because those 12 votes represent 4/5 of the majority of 4/5 of the population embraced by the authority. And that's strange. It's odd, but that's what the plain meaning of the statute is. It is different than, and I don't know if that was considered by the General Assembly, whether it was purposeful, whether it was an oversight by not including the word majority in that particular sentence. The other transportation authorities, the NVTA and HRTAC, have a little bit of a different language in their statute, and we looked at that. And for instance, they say an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the members. Okay, so that's clear. Our statute says an affirmative vote of those present and voting whose votes represent at least 4/5 of the population. It doesn't say an affirmative vote of those present and voting and whose votes represent 4/5 of the population embraced. It doesn't have that. Now, a simple addition of the word and, or even a comma, or the word majority could change the meaning. But without that, I can't read that word in or an additional word into the statute. Without that, then it means what it says. And so that's the rules of the body. And I don't know if that was on purpose. The General Assembly is presumed to know what they're doing when they pass legislation, and they use words precisely. They did not use the word majority in this case. We did go back and look at all of the committee hearings during which this legislation was considered, and this particular question, this particular issue was not discussed. Whether it was discussed, during the legislative process, I don't know. I wasn't part of that. The voting tool was developed on the presumption that an affirmative vote equals a majority vote. But in this issue, the question that we're dealing with, or that we had to deal with after that meeting on the 29th, and now today, was never broached before. The body has never been put in a place where it had to consider this particular interpretation of the statute. And this particular interpretation of the statute, to my knowledge, was never proposed because we were always on the acting under the understanding that it was a majority vote, and the majority vote had to represent 4/5 of the population. But that's under this interpretation, which has been proposed, which I cannot disagree with. It only requires that those votes represent 4/5 of the population of the authority. Now, would it be prudent or wise or a positive move to change the law to require that majority vote? Perhaps. It would certainly make it more consistent with overriding or fundamental principles, but that's for others to decide. The legislature, the General Assembly may consider that, but we have to deal with what we have in the statute right now, and that's where we are. It's just this particular interpretation was never, to my knowledge, advanced by anyone, and was not considered, because the fundamental rule in Robert's Rules of Order and in every other public body that I've ever worked with and that others have worked with is that affirmative vote is a majority vote, clearly. So you don't really have to go anywhere else other than that. But in this case, we do, because the rules of the body are a little different, and Robert's Rules of Order recognizes that possibility. I did, just to provide some comfort, I did confer with local legal counsel for a number of the member jurisdictions, and we talked about this, and some shared opinions, some didn't, but I did confer with them and speak with them, and the plain meaning of the words on the page is what it is.
So obviously, I have a couple questions.
Mr. Brown.
And so first I want to establish, so that is your interpretation is that a 4/5 of the population can carry an action notwithstanding the per capita vote of the membership of the body, meaning that the individual jurisdictions have votes, and those votes are weighted per the statute.
Correct.
And so notwithstanding the weighting and the fact that there was an intentionality to create that weighting structure, that this provision controls entirely. I just want to make sure I'm clear on that.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I agree with you that it does cause one to question, well, why even have the weighted voting scheme in there? It's what's the purpose? And I don't know the answer to that question, but the sentence that governs how decisions are made says what it says.
Right, so one of the things that I think we need to think through, and I appreciate Mr. Gregory's perspective, is that there are general rules to interpretation. And one of the things that you would want to do is you try to construe the entire statute, right? So that it would be effective. And again, in the context of the other jurisdictions as well, the weighting structures were put in place because they were intended to have meaning. But if you interpret just that provision to suggest that only the population matters, then the rest of the statute would have no meaning or import. Just acknowledging that that's one of the provisions in which a court would interpret the statute.
Possibly. I think it does cause one to question why the voting scheme is even in there, or the weighted voting scheme rather. And what purpose does it then serve? Whether that is a flaw in the statute or an oversight in the legislative process, I don't know. But and I agree that you do have to read the statute in its entirety and try to interpret it in such a way that it will work. But nevertheless, the statute, or the sentence rather, governing decisions says what it says, and I can't read. I would like, a part of me would like to read in a word, an additional word, sort of into the sentence, but I can't do that.
Well, but I guess the point I'm making is that it's not just the sentence that governs decisions, it's actually the entire provision. And the entire provision, which establishes the weighting voting and then goes to the issue of shall require an affirmative vote. And in the plain understanding, common language, an affirmative vote would be a majority. That is the common understanding of
Unless the rules of the body provide otherwise.
Well,
And in this
but
case, it appears
that's
that
only
they
the
do.
case, you only negate the common reading of the word affirmative if there's an intent to, right? If there's a meaning, you know, the facts are that this issue was never challenged or debated because, quite frankly, no one had a motivation to try to interpret the statute in a way that would yield a result other than what the common understanding would have been. And I think if you fairly polled everyone around this table, everyone in the authority, and it's ultimately the authority's decision to interpret the statute, not council. Council can advise, but it's the authority's decision to interpret the statute. No one in the authority itself would have interpreted the statute to suggest that a pure population-based vote would have yielded an outcome different than an affirmative vote. And I'll take the privilege of saying, since I wrote a lot of this language, I can tell you exactly what we intended, and the jurisdictions that were party to the conversations. It was the UN Security Council model, which meant that the three jurisdictions could veto an action, but there was never an interpretation that would allow the three large jurisdictions independently to carry an action. Delegate McQuinn carried the legislation. She and I collaborated on that, along with the jurisdictions who were parties to those conversations. This conversation would sound very familiar to all those folks. And so, again, I guess the thing that I would stress just for the point of this issue is that you only get to the conclusion that you have arrived at or that others have advocated if you choose to not interpret affirmative to mean majority. That's the only way you get there. If affirmative means majority, then, so if you read this, shall require a majority vote of those present and voting, whose votes represent at least 4/5 of the population. I don't think you get to this question. I think you are separating the per capita representation and vote from the population issue. And I think that those two coincide. But again, we don't still need to debate this. I just think the body to understand that. And I play I wear your hat in other cases. I advise a lot. There are frequently times that my advice is not followed by folks who have the ability to make an independent decision. So I just want to make that clear. So we can go on from there.
Sorry.
No, Mr. Craig.
No, I hear you, Mr. Brown, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that the statute is problematic and an affirmative vote. The statute, that's why the voting tool was constructed the way it was, is that the assumption was that an affirmative vote is a majority vote. And all the localities, representatives had a hand in development of the voting tool. We were always of that view. Now, this is a new take, but it defines the sentence at issue defines what an affirmative vote is, right? So you don't need the word in order to understand the statute the way we have come to understand it now. You don't need the word majority because it tells you what an affirmative vote is, and that is an affirmative vote is those votes cast representing 4/5 of the population of the region. So I agree with you, but I also disagree with you in some ways, right? So
What does it mean with the word present, of those votes present? So for example, Mr. Thornton isn't here today, so can this body take an action since we would not have 4/5 of the population represented?
This particular rule doesn't apply to the finance committee.
And that's your
Committees-
interpretation.
Yeah, that is.
Right, exactly.
The finance committee and the other committees of the body, my guidance has always been that it operates on a simple majority vote of one person, one vote, one member, one vote. Because those rules apply to the body, not necessarily the committees. So, and it would be impossible for committees to operate under this scheme, right? So,
Well, not necessarily, because actually with the 3 representatives here, they would represent 4/5, and they could essentially, I mean, and again, just not to be argumentative, effectively, none of the rest of us would need to be here if that interpretation is applied. And I've said to the chairman, and others, that I'm gonna stop coming if my vote doesn't matter.
but you still have to have a quorum.
Well, that's right, but if only Chesterfield, Richmond, and Enrico's votes matter to carry an action, then the rest of us don't need to show up. That's the fundamental result of that interpretation. And that clearly was not the intent of the statute or the drafting, and I can speak to that, because again, I was in the room when most of that was happening, that to negate the import and the relevance of the rest of the region. And I think that adopting that interpretation would do great harm to the goodwill that we've tried to create with the CVTA, because the only reason to adopt that interpretation is really to press through. And I think at the end of the day, we're gonna get to a point where 64 gets included and all that stuff, but it does harm now for a very short-sighted purpose. And I just would really impress on this body to not advocate for that position when effectively we can go back to the CTBA, the general body, take action on a recommendation from this body that would be inclusive and satisfactory, and not go down this route. And of course, if there's a desire to clarify the statute, we can do that next year. But I think to insist on the action that happened in May and make that valid, relying on this interpretation would be to do great harm to the goodwill of the region. And I'll just stop there. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's agreement across the board, including the county attorneys and city attorneys, that there's ambiguity in this part of the statute. Is that correct? That the statute is a bit ambiguous as to what was intended here.
I would say it's a bit ambiguous, but you'd only, I say that cautiously, because that's, ambiguity is a term of art. And so and you only get to the rules of statutory interpretation if it is indeed ambiguous.
Well, we have a lot of different interpretations going on, so that means it's ambiguous to some degree. Does that require a change in the statute, or does that require a change in the bylaws to clarify what CBTA's interpretation of this is?
Well, I'm happy to respond. The no change in the bylaws would override the language of the statute. But that's a good point, that you could supplement the understanding or formalize the interpretation and understanding of the statute through a bylaws provision or a guidance document. You could do that, absolutely. I think if a desire is to, if the desire is there to address the ambiguity in the statute, I think that's a job for the legislature. But the CVTA, Mr. Brown's exactly right. It's the body's job to interpret its statute. I mean, if it ever got that way, it would be a court's job. Got to that point, it would be a court's job. But it's the body has to live and work with its statute, so it interprets the statute. But if it, could request a change to the legislation if that were desired, but right now we're dealing with what we have, so bylaws provision may help.
I guess what I'm trying to get to is if we're dealing with changing the statute, we're talking about next year. Cindy's gone. If we're talking, and which means we have to live with whatever we're dealing. I would, and really it's not I don't believe that's a responsibility of Finance Committee to make those determinations. I would, but I would suggest, if possible, that Delegate McQuinn be requested to join the CVTA at the next meeting to help understand the full intent of how things were put into play in this, which may help the full body determine how we should go forward with this, and also as to whether that goes back for change.
Mr. Gregory.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, thank you. What I would caution, so ultimately, depending on where this goes, the body is going to have to decide on the interpretation of the vote that was taken on Mrs. O'Bannon's, Supervisor O'Bannon's motion at that meeting. Did it pass or did it fail? Okay, and that depends on your interpretation of the statute. So the body's going to have to decide soon what that interpretation is. Now, I've walked you through the various determinations. Mr. Brown has helped in that, and I appreciate that. Thank you. And you're right. The ambiguity, I think, is the case can be made that the statute is ambiguous, and it's difficult, no doubt. What I'd like to caution the body about is that when a vote is taken, either way, you could be caught in the death spiral, if you will. So the question is, does a vote carry? And let's say that the same thing plays out again, that Henrico, Chesterfield, and Richmond vote in favor. So that's 12 votes representing 4/5 of the population. And then all 14 other votes are cast against. What's the result of that? Okay. Now, under this interpretation, that vote would carry. Would that be satisfactory to all the other 14 votes or the members of the authority? I'm not so sure. The body has to deal with that. I'm trying to help, but the body has to come, this is a political question, the body has to come to a political resolution on this. And whether legislation is later pursued to make it more clear, that probably would be helpful, but right now is where we are, and I'll stop there.
We're gonna go to Mr. Carroll and then wrap this up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's keep in mind a couple of things. In the last several years of the existence of the CBTA, of all the votes that have been taken, with the exception of this one, and the exception of 2 votes, which occurred when we were trying to nominate each other for chair and vice chair in the very first meeting, those votes of the authority have been collectively unanimous on almost every single issue that's been brought before the CVTA. The vote in question was a vote to approve a spending plan that had been, and let's go back to how this all came to fruition. That over the last 2 years, collectively, we all worked together to come up with a procedure on how we would approve projects, right? A weighted system similar to Smart Scale that would evaluate projects to the TAC to be recommended for funding. We all agreed unanimously on that process that would be utilized. There was not one single no vote on that. So again, collectively, all of us together worked through that process. The process was established. There was a then all of the localities submitted their projects to the TAC to be evaluated. They were evaluated, they were brought forward in a spending plan to the Finance Committee, which we looked at it. The people who were here on the Finance Committee looked at that, and we voted unanimously to approve it forward. And then it was advertised to the community for 2 weeks for input, and we got plenty of input from the community. And others had the opportunity to have input if they felt that there was an issue and we needed to do something else. And when it was brought before the body, the question was whether or not we approve a plan that we've been working on for 2 years for transportation for the region. There were those who wanted to pause the plan because we had to have a conversation about 64. I don't disagree with having a conversation about 64. Quite frankly, we should have had it before it was brought forward. But we didn't. We have now, and I think we have a plan moving forward with the help of the state, with the help of the legislature, with the help of the secretary, to put funding in place and commit funding from us. So it's not like the vote that we took that was carried by Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield was a negative vote. It was a vote to approve a transportation plan for the entire region, what we've been working on for 2 years. It doesn't preclude us from coming back and having another discussion or adding or making a recommendation from this committee on additional funds that could be put forward for New Kent. I didn't write the statute, Carlos. I didn't. You were involved in that, right? But as the council has said, words have meaning. And my interpretation, my legal counsel's interpretation is exactly that. Might not like it. I think that it could be amended in the future if the General Assembly chooses to do so. But keep in mind, for the last 2 years, we've not had this issue. And and by the way, if Hanover, if you don't mind me using your county as an add to this, if Hanover had voted with the three of us, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now, because not only would it have been a majority weighted vote, but it also would have been the other vote would have carried. So there is a provision in the statute that prevents Henrico, Richmond, and Chesterfield from actually voting to kill a project in another jurisdiction. So it's not like there isn't a provision in the statute that covers that. We voted to approve projects. Others voted to not approve projects, which was baffling to me, considering that there were projects in your jurisdictions. I understand the meaning behind it. The meaning behind it was, let's take a minute, let's pause, and let's move forward. I get that. But what Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield did was not a negative thing. We actually voted to approve projects. And now we have an opportunity from the Finance Committee, which is what our charge is, not to determine the statute, but to determine what we can do to add on to that to resolve the 64 issue, which is what I want to get to now. But I think it's important for people who are watching to understand what the vote was. It was a good vote to approve money, $276 million for the entire region. That's not a bad thing. Now we can have another vote to fix 64. Mr. Chair, that's all I have to say.
All right. With that said, Mr. Parsons, Mr. Roddy, CVTA Regional Funding Commitment Update.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Kevin, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I think the next discussion to have, so what we've looked at and staff was charged with was, you know, if 64 is something you want to work in, how to do it into what you've already done. But I think you'll probably need to have the discussion on, you know, if you want to include 64 and the amount that you want to include on 64 before we try to take that next leap, that it's something you want to do, and how what your options for fitting it in would be.
Mr. Chair. So what would be, if we, you know, we did up to year 4 here. So looking at year 5, we could do a letter of commitment. Could we do a letter of commitment to the state for $100 million? And how would it look like? How would we have to fund that? Would we have to issue bonds? But potentially in year 5, excluding what we did in the first 4 years here, in year 5, we could do that, right?
Yes.
Okay, and what could that look like?
You know, there are so many.
Mr. Wright, he means what could that look like in terms of
How we would
the
structure it.
mechanism?
Yeah,
Yes.
how we would structure it.
Yeah, so you'll have more revenues coming in, you'll have projects potentially drop along the way. So there's a lot of uncertainty even in the 4-year period that we're gonna be
But
into.
potentially, we could move it up even sooner if necessary.
Could be,
But at a minimum, a commitment we could put forward is in year 5, a commitment for $100 million from the CVTA for 64 widening, which could be utilized by the CTB to leverage towards smart scale dollars. Because I think, and I'm not trying to speak out of turn, but a conversation we just had would be that the CTB, because we didn't include in the smart scale project only from 205 to 211, that the CTB could actually do an overall sponsorship of the entire project. And those funds that we could commit, along with the $470 million from the General Assembly and any federal dollars, would help this project score very well in the smart scale process. And so I just want to make sure that everybody knows that we have the capacity to do this if we choose to in year 5.
you do, and you don't have to make the determination today, in our opinion, on whether it would be pay-go or debt. So you're not necessarily, I can tell you with assurance that you've got debt capacity, but I don't think we're making that decision today. You've got room on, lack of a better word, your credit card, that if that's what's, was determined several years from now you wanted to do, you could do that. But I don't think you're having to make that determination today.
And I think to Mr. Peterson's comment at the last Finance Committee meeting, which I thought was brilliant, is that we've been viewing the plan that was proposed as the first 4 years of a 6-year plan, or sorry, as the last 4 years of a 6-year plan that would have started in 2020. Whereas we could look at this as the first 4 years of a 6-year plan starting in 2022, which then creates, just doing rough math, $260 million of unallocated capacity in that 6-year plan based upon the current forecast that we haven't allocated, committed, or what have you. So that clearly allows you to do it pay-go in the worst case scenario or the most conservative scenario, or again, you can put it on a credit card. So does that make sense? Am I
Yes.
saying that correctly? So again, adopting Mr. Peterson's interpretation or approach, we're still in the 6-year plan. We got capacity that's unallocated. And to Mr. Carroll's comment, we don't necessarily have to make the decision of how we're going to do it. We just simply need to say we're in. And I apologize for the disruption, but I was texting the secretary and he called me and I wanted him to have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Carroll. You were chairing the meeting, so I didn't put him on speaker. But I didn't want to have an illegal meeting, but as Mr. Gregory has cautioned me. So the secretary said, look, yeah, I know that there's some back and forth about the number. And he said, look, if the CBTA comes on, puts a stake in the ground, 100 million, we can work with that. So you have successfully negotiated down from 125 million to 100 million, Mr. Chairman, so you get credit for that.
No one will ever call me a conservative, That made Mr. Carroll red in the face, I tell you that. Mr. Peterson, anything further?
No, I think we're on the right track here. I think we need to do what we've already planned, and we need to do I-64 too. And I don't know if that means we need to add some additional projects for those couple of years, but as part of the 6-year plan that may have been left out. But I think all of them that were submitted were included except I-64.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And I will say, I as a young authority, I like us having some flexibility, particularly as we start to navigate this over the first 6 years. And so it's not for us to go to the extremes and say we're going to use the whole 200, all the unallocated capacity that we have. The question I do have though, and I don't know whether or not Mr. Brown can fill me in about this, I did listen very closely at the joint regional meeting this past week, and I still did not come away from the secretary's comments on where our partners in Hampton Roads were on all this. I know, we can only control the things we can control, right? And that's what we do here at this table and what we do at the large table of the authority. However, I understand the financial outlays that the HR tech has made over the course of the last decade. I commend them for that. However, obviously, it seems to me from the secretary's comments that this project won't happen without partnership. And if we're gonna make this sort of investment, we gotta ensure that, no one's gonna come back to the authority some years later and say, well, your partners in southeast part of the Commonwealth were unable to make that commitment, so how are we gonna close the gap? So can someone, at least, for my edification, tell me where we may be?
So the fundamental point here, I can give you some other color, is that the Commonwealth and Secretary is asking us to take some leadership here. There is a number that is being negotiated within Hampton Roads. I didn't send this around, and I don't know, Chad, can we put this, if I send this to someone, to Ms. Firestone, can you put this on the screen? It's a document that was prepared by VDOT that shows the relative proportion of Hampton Roads Park versus the CVTA. Can someone put this on, send to you?
Sure.
Chad?
Yes.
Okay.
You mean by mileage?
By mileage,
Yes.
and then also shows the respective.
The lane miles and,
Right.
I guess for everybody,
Yeah.
for everyone's good, I guess but I think we all have a good understanding of how many miles are actually HR tech's responsibility, how many miles
But
are
also-
in,
I think it's 5 for them and 24 for us, I believe.
Sure.
because the line goes 64 into New Kent and James City County, right?
Actually, it's, this depiction actually corrects some of that assumption, so.
Okay.
I'll speak to it while it's getting over to chat. There are 19 miles in the Richmond district, going to mile 224. And there are 10 miles in Hampton Roads, so roughly 2/3, 1/3. The initial request from Hampton Roads was $100 million as well. Based on the recent conversation, that number is, probably gonna be less than 100, but will be more than 50. And part of what we can suggest in our process is that, notwithstanding what Hampton Roads does, we have 19 miles to do in the Richmond district, which, and all of that is a new kid. It was interesting, I had a conversation, and I think there was some misunderstanding about that entire period, that entire stretch is a new kid. I think because of the way the new kid application came in, there was some assumption that those additional miles were not in New Kent, but they are in New Kent.
Clarify that again.
Meaning-
What additional miles, the Hampton Roads?
So there was some interpretation because of the way the applications came in that it was only 205 to exit 211. But it's actually, and Ms. Page is back there, I believe, all the way up to maybe 220.
Exactly.
So basically all the way up to 220 is New Kent. Now, I don't know if those last 4 miles to 224 is, that's at 224.
James City County, right now, James City County stops at 234. In the original bill, they wanted to bring it from 234 to exit 223.
Right, so 224 is Richmond District. So that entire 19 miles is the Richmond District. It is in New Kent and would be our responsibility. So roughly 2/3 of the gap is the Richmond District. 1/3 is the Hampton Roads District.
So when you get to exit 220, which is the last, the exit, you go to West Point, that is not the end of New Kent. But when
It's
you
just the
get-
last exit in New Kent.
It's the last exit in New Kent,
But yeah, it's a few more miles until you get to the James City County line.
Right.
absolutely. And you have another exit between 220 and 234. So they have come up now to 234 in James City County.
And so this illustration was simply to clarify that if we're talking about being equitable, right? It would be a 2/3, 1/3 share if we were doing that. I think right now, the expectations that Hampton Roads would do more than their 1/3 of this gap. But I think if we keep talking, they'll get more clarity around what their obligation would be.
All I am is repeating the words of the secretary.
Right. So,
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Carroll.
I think something that would be beneficial, quite frankly, is for members of the CVTA to meet with members of the Hampton Roads Transportation Authority prior to our next meeting, in order to be able to have some understanding of what their authority is prepared to do, so that we can bring that information back, or even have them, a representative, come to our next meeting. So that when we bring a proposal forward from here to there, to our full body, that the full body will have an opportunity to get the answers to the questions that you're asking. That is, that what can be their commitment, and then based on that understanding, the full body would have an opportunity to make a vote as to what we think our commitment could be. We just need to make a recommendation from us to the full body of what we, as a placeholder, so the full body can consider it.
Yes, sir.
And then get the other information from HR TAC, as well as this type of presentation that Mr. Brown has just put up, as well as the update on the funding in the state budget, and as well as what the federal application shows. That'll give the full body a big picture about what the funding mechanism could look like, and then the full body at that point, regardless of what recommendation comes from here, can make a decision on what that number could be for a long-term commitment from the CVTA. And I think that's probably where we need to go with this. Just my thoughts.
Mr. Peterson.
I think one of the things we've said earlier is we cannot control what Hampton Roads does.
That's right.
But there's obviously a lot of conversations going on offline that I think are positive conversations. But I do think it's our responsibility to step up and say, hey, we're gonna do our part. And I'm gonna be happy if you want a motion to move that we add $100 million in year 5 for the I-64 widening as this placeholder that you're talking about, and whether we do it in terms of establishing a full 6-year plan or do it as a letter of intent for the 5th year, however we do it, but to say, okay, CVTA is gonna do our part to make this happen, and which in turn, I think puts more pressure on everybody else to do their part. But if
that's the
we-
motion, I'll second it.
All right, there's a motion.
Mr. Carroll wants to benefit.
Mr. Gregg.
You already did it, that's
Oh,
fine.
no. Can we co-second it?
Mr. Gregg.
So just to understand correctly, the motion is to recommend that the full authority send a letter to the Secretary of Transportation committing to $100 million in funding the project in year 5.
All right, well, let's have the conversation on my motion before we do that, because I did put 2 parts. I said either fully develop a 6-year plan
Yeah, so.
or just put in the letter, but in fully developing a 6-year plan requires me to go back to TAC and see, what kind of time frame we're dealing with there, and because we're only adding 1 project for the next 2 years.
Mr. Parsons.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the motion from Mr. Peterson and the understanding that there's a lot of other parts at work here. I think there are other projects to be considered for those out years that to use Mr. Roddy's metaphor, the credit card could still cover those as well. But there's still some uncertainty about when those would be necessary and how that would work. So staff would support the development of a letter. At this point, talking about a future
Okay.
commitment.
That's my motion, the letter.
TAC will still
Not
have
the
time.
6-year plan.
Yes.
All right, there's a motion on the floor for a letter to the Secretary of Transportation of the Commonwealth of Virginia $100 million commitment from the CVTA that we recommended to the full body in year 5.
Mr. Chairman, just further discussion on that? I mean, I would think based on the conversation we had with our financial advisor, that this is something that is, that can come before the full body for consideration.
Okay. So we have a motion, it has been seconded. Ms. Firestone.
Mr. Carroll.
Aye.
Vice Chair Peterson.
Aye.
Chair Stoney.
Aye.
Mr. Brown.
Aye.
Thank you. The motion carries.
The motion is carried. It will be recommended to the full body. Move on to the remainder of our agenda. Mr. Parsons, you have anything further in item 7?
No, sir, I think we covered it.
All right, item 8 is the future meeting topics. We obviously want you to be present in our future meetings where we will be discussing items like the investment portfolio review, the third quarter reporting update, presentation on new auditing standards and key audit matters, and the financial policy review and amendments and regional projects fund allocation. Those are topics that will be taken up in future meetings, so please mark your calendars. Any further comments from the members?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
I will provide you the privilege, yes.
Thank you so much. One thing I absolutely want to be very clear about, I've read numerous articles, and I've heard it in our meetings. The I-64 is not just about New Kent County. It impacts New Kent County. It has, in a very negative way when we talk about safety. It impacts New Kent County with economic development. It impacts New Kent County with tourism. However, the I-64, as they said, gap, the 29 miles, the connective opportunity, however you want to call the I-64 that runs through New Kent County. How awesome would it be for the CVTA to be able to stand up and say, we support this widening that influences the Port of Virginia, as well as their port in Norfolk, as well as tourism and economic global development in the entire Commonwealth. It is not just about New Kent County. It is New Kent County's responsibility for the numerous tourists that come through. We are recognized to have the busiest rest area in the Commonwealth. That's how, we have the busiest rest area in New Kent County in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's how much traffic is on that stretch of interstate. And so I think for us to take this move, not only does it benefit the Commonwealth, however, it is, and I am a good steward of all funding, but if we prolong this, the costs only increase. And we know that now with the rising costs of all material and everything that comes with construction. So I would like to make that statement and to thank this body for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Page. Any other further comments from the members?
Chair.
Mr. Carroll.
I do appreciate Ms. Page's comments, because that's why it's very important to have the commitment from the CTB and the rest of the state and our region, because this is a much bigger issue than just New Kent. This is certainly everything that she just said, and so I look forward to being able to ride on that road, nice and smooth, to get to Hampton Roads in the future.
Right now, you can park on it.
Well, it depends on the time of day. You can go there at night, you're not parking.
Mr. Parsons, you have something to add?
Yes, sir. Additional item, staff has been working on a memo for consideration by the full board addressing the vote on April 29th and kind of the discussion that we've had here today. So I'd like to pass that out after the meeting for review by Finance Committee, and then we'll make sure if everyone's in agreement, we can forward that on for the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. And I will add, as a son of Hampton Roads and a leader here in the greater Richmond region, Mr. Brown is as well. He's just.
Your nephew of the road.
So what'd you say?
Nephew of the
Yeah. It's obvious that it's a win-win for everyone,
Absolutely.
right? Win-win for everyone, and that's what I think more elected leaders in all levels of government should be seeking these days, which is unfortunately missing. With that, the next meeting is on July 13th, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much.
So you're familiar with